as long as we realize that those are at a lower stage. There's an ultimate reality of God, Ein Sof, the infinite, and then God can be described in very human ways. So some of what the Kabbalah said about God, for example, the romance within God, the male and female aspects of God, that would make Maimonides turn over in his grave, even though he would be fully comfortable with what the Zohar says about Ein Sof, the ultimate reality of God.
So this is really an evolution. It's a big evolution from the Torah as we know it.
Yes, it's really good you use that word, because I would say that's part of what Kabbalah is saying, that we should allow God to evolve, that we should recognize that God evolves and that our understanding of God evolves. We shouldn't be trapped in the original or the earlier view of God. We shouldn't reject it, but we should see that God can unfold, and the Torah can unfold. The Torah can unfold in meaning, and we should be part of that unfolding and celebrate the fact that religion is not limited to any one formulation.
On page 149 of the Essential Kabbalah, you say, "You can mend the cosmos by anything you do, even eating. Do not imagine that God wants you to eat for mere pleasure or to fill your belly. No, the purpose is mending." Talk about that.
Yes, I should say, first of all, anything you're quoting from the Essential Kabbalah, these are original texts of Kabbalah that I've translated.
Okay, very good.
The Zohar and from other writings. At the back of the book, I have small comments about them, but the passages themselves are not my thoughts. They're my translations of Kabbalistic texts.
Very good.
So the one that you're referring to is very interesting. It really brings us to the topic of tikkun, which I translate there as mending. You could translate it repair or fixing or perfection. This was taught by the great Jewish mystic Isaac Luria, who lived in the Galilean town of Safed about 300 years after the Zohar in the 16th century. And he taught, basically he had a very interesting approach to God and creation. What he said was, let's imagine that originally there was only God. All that existed was God before the world came into being. So Luria asks, if everything was God, how can there be a world at all? How can there be anything but God now? Why would God change from being everything to limiting himself? And Luria says, in fact, God had to withdraw. God had to withdraw himself from himself. As it were, God is making a small gap within this ocean of divinity. God pulls back in every direction and creates a small hole in the middle of God, which is now empty of God. And within that small gap, that is where God creates the world. That's how the world comes into existence. So the divine energy pours into that gap and begins creation, but the power of the divine is too much for the world to hold, and the world shatters. According to Luria, creation begins, you could say, with a kind of catastrophe. The world shatters because it can't handle the power of the divine energy, and that's why we live in a broken world. But that's not the end of the story. That just sets the stage for tikkun, for mending or repair. It's our task to repair the world. We should really restore the world to God by turning the mundane or the secular into the holy. How do we do that? By following the Torah, by living holy lives. If we live in holy and spiritual and ethical ways, then we can raise the sparks. That's the image that Luria uses. The divine sparks within all of material existence. You could almost think of it like energy and matter, as a physicist might describe it. All material existence is really permeated with energy. From a spiritual perspective, what we should do is to focus on those sparks, and through becoming aware of the divine potential in the world, and through acting on that awareness, we can raise the sparks back to God. We can transform the material to the spiritual. In that particular passage, Luria talks about doing it through the act of eating. So eating isn't just a gluttonous experience. It's not just, satisfying your hunger. It's also an opportunity to to do something with that energy. And the act of eating and the result of eating can become holy.
There's another piece that says God is dynamic becoming and remains incomplete. God needs us. That is really a different kind of context for relating to God, that God needs us. Why?
Yes, that's really one of the radical notions of Kabbalah. I would say, if listeners want just a quick summary of Kabbalah, I would say there are three major insights of Kabbalah. One is that God is ultimately infinite. God is Ein Sof. We shouldn't think of God as Father in heaven. We should outgrow those childish notions of God and realize that ultimately God is the infinite energy. The second insight is that if we're going to describe God, if we're going to use traditional images, we should balance the masculine with the feminine. We should realize that God is equally male and female, although ultimately beyond both genders. And the third insight is just what you said now: God needs us. This is called in Hebrew tzorech gavoa, the need on high. That God actually is in need of us. And that sounds very strange. How can God need us? Isn't God perfect? Well, according to Kabbalah, God is somehow incomplete without our active participation. Unless we're involved in the world, unless we try to improve the world, to improve ourselves, to improve our relationships, to help society grow and develop, unless we do that, we're leaving God incomplete. So in that sense, God needs us to be actualized in the world. As I mentioned before, God is the secret of the possible, and without our help, that potential can never be fully realized.
It's a very deep context for relating to what we're referring to as God, the divine, the infinite.
Right. It really makes it more of a partnership. It's not, this perfect God, and here I am, this incomplete and sinful creature. It's really that we're in this together. God is challenging us to live up to a certain ideal, and God needs our awareness in order to be fully actualized himself. It's a very exciting theology.
I am that I am.
Yes, in a way, even though Kabbalah is very new and radical, it's really kind of spelling out that name of God, which God reveals to Moses at the burning bush, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Right there, God is saying, don't fit me into a box. Don't define me in any one way. God is unfolding being, and we have to unfold along with him and her.
It also says in the book that evil must be encountered, not evaded. That is brilliant. Talk about that.
Yes, this is a very radical notion of Kabbalah, and some aroused a good deal of opposition, because really you have different approaches to evil in the tradition, in all religious traditions. Within Judaism, you would think the more normal approach is to fight evil, to uproot evil, to rid the world of evil. And if lustful thoughts or if evil thoughts come to you, you should avoid them. You should flee from them. You shouldn't encounter them, because if you encounter them, if you engage them, you might give in to them. But the Kabbalah says that really, if you just flee from evil, you'll never escape it, because evil temptation is just too potent to leave you alone. You can't really avoid temptation constantly. And therefore, the Kabbalah says you have to actually engage with temptation, not give in to it, not surrender to it, but somehow, you might say, transmute it. Take that raw elemental power of passion, let's say, and transform that. Let that fuel you. Let the passion fuel you. Don't flee from the power of the temptation, but engage it and redirect it, rechannel it. And that's a very bold approach. It's certainly a dangerous one. But the Kabbalah sees that as a more holistic and ultimately more fulfilling approach.
Evil reminds me of a Gordian knot, in that the more you try to get